Good evening. My name is Bill Arnold. I teach Old Testament interpretation here at Asbury Theological Seminary, and I would like to welcome you this evening to this special event on behalf of Seedbed, which is our publishing initiative who is sponsoring this event, and Asbury Seminary. We welcome all of you. I see a lot of students here. You know you're welcome. Also, friends from the university across the street. If you're from a local congregation, welcome. I have the great privilege of introducing a very dear and old friend of mine. Not only is he an old friend of mine, I've known him for many years. I think I have this honor because I've known John for so long. I met him in 1980 when I was a new graduate student, entering graduate student at Hebrew Union College. And John was in his last stages of dissertating, so that we entering students saw him as some icon that we hoped someday to be like. Of course, he was 5 years old and I was 2 at the time, so we were very young in graduate school. I thought about the way I would introduce John, so I'll give you the standard thing. I mean, he has degrees from Muhlenberg College and from Wheaton Graduate School, his PhD from Hebrew Union College in 1981. I also thought about bringing all of the books that he's written. On the webpage at Wheaton, where he is now a professor in the graduate school, there are 19 books that he has to his credit. I thought about collecting all of them from my office and bringing them over here, but I didn't have a wheelbarrow available to get them all over. So I decided instead to bring, in good Hebrew inclusio fashion, the first book he ever published and the most recent book that he's published. And there's a story about the first book he ever published. I was in the library or in the bookstore at Hebrew Union College one day, and I saw chronological charts of the Old Testament by John H. Walton. And I thought, I've just met a John Walton. And I went straight to another friend of mine who was also a new student, Brian Beyer, and I said, you won't believe what I just saw. I saw a book, a Zondervan book, written by a guy with the same name as our John Walton. And Brian said, you idiot, that's John Walton. And I knew right away that John was way ahead of the curve of the rest of us in his graduate studies. This is a book that's been around. It's still in print, John, widely used by students, chronological charts of the Old Testament. If you're really interested, after the lecture tonight, you can come see me, and I will show you his photograph from the mid-'80s. Which is really wonderful. It's that's a kicking mustache you've got there, John. So and I'll be happy to embarrass you with that. The most recent book that he has published is a festschrift for his professor, Windows to the Ancient World of the Hebrew Bible, Essays in Honor of Samuel Gringus. This is, without doubt, the best festschrift to be released in the past 5 days. So we want to congratulate you, John, on that work as well. There are many, many other books he's written. He's going to be sharing the fruits of his research and writing with us tonight. I know you're going to welcome him with me to Asbury Seminary.
What Bill failed to mention was that I am an editor in that last volume, and he is also an editor in that last volume, and he did far more work on it than I did. Okay, but yeah, so it's out. So, well, welcome. Thanks for coming, and I hope we have a good evening together as we discuss some important information. People believe there's a war out there, that you've got science and you've got the Bible, and that they make claims that are contradictory to one another, and therefore we find ourselves in the very awkward position of having to choose and to try to figure out where we stand. And it's not a controversy that's just inside the halls of the church. It's a controversy that's out there, everywhere out there, this conversation. And so we have to talk about this issue and to figure out how we come down on it. And so this presentation called Origins Today, Genesis Through Ancient Dyes, is a way for us to talk about it. One of the things we want to decide is there really a war? And if there is, what's the shape of it? How does it all come down, and how do we try to make our decisions? I've been traveling around. I've had the great fortune to have some funding and traveling around with this material over the last year or so. And I spent a week or so in various countries in Eastern Europe presenting this information. And they too, even though it's not the American shape of the war, but they too feel that warfare issue, because as they were under the influence of communism for so many decades, they came to think that atheism, communism, and evolution kind of all go together. They were bundled tightly. And it was very hard for them to think outside that box. Different shape of the war, but still the war. Now, if we're going to think in terms of the war mentality, we have to try to make sure that we understand what position each side takes. Okay, what claims are being made, so we can examine exactly what's going on with all of that. And so we need to take a look at those claims, and tonight we're going to spend time looking at the claims the Bible makes. I'm certainly not here to talk about the claims that science makes. I'm not a scientist, and I don't have any scientific position to present, any scientific position to defend. So science is not the topic for discussion. The topic is going to be the Bible and what claims it makes. In the end, I'm a text guy. That's my training. I spent my life trying to do careful exegesis in the biblical text and trying to understand the texts of the ancient world and how they can contribute to our understanding of the biblical text. So that's going to be our focus, to try to understand the book of Genesis through ancient eyes. And that doesn't mean ones that need trifocals. It means thinking about the text as an ancient document. It's not a bad thing that we want to try to see how the Bible fits into our modern questions, modern issues and concerns. That's not a bad thing, but it might be a little more problematic if we're thinking about the Bible as if it is a modern text. So, if we're going to start talking about the Bible's claims, we need to start right at the beginning and talk about the issue of biblical authority. How does that all work? Now, the way this is set up, and this is the way we've all learned about it, the idea is that God's purpose is carried out through human purpose. We've got a dual authorship going on here, human and divine. And God decided, apparently, since it's what we've got, God decided that he was going to communicate through particular human beings in a particular language, a particular culture, particular time and place. This was God's decision, and we really can't play Monday morning quarterback on it. This is the way he decided to do it. And so that means that if we're going to get to God's message, we've got to go through that author, okay, that communicator, because that's how the transaction worked. And so we have this authority that's vested in a human author. It's not the human author's authority, it's the authority of God. But we have to go through that author to get it, and that means we have to understand what that author is communicating, because what he's got to say in his time and place, in his language, to his audience, that has authority. And that's what we need to get to. Now, through this, we come to understand that the Bible is written for us, but not to us. Well, I say that so often you'd think I wouldn't stumble on it, but every once in a while I do. The Bible is written for us, but not to us. And by that we mean that the message transcends culture, but the form of it is culture-bound. And therefore, we expect a message coming out of Scripture that we can all benefit from, that is sound theology and revealing God to us. We expect that message to be something that's meaningful to us. But the form of it is culture-bound. And that means we've got a little bit of work to do. Because that means in order to get to that communication as clearly as we can, we have to try to join the audience, that original audience, and take our place there and hear it as they would hear it. We shouldn't expect that they're going to have the same questions that we have, the same issues that we have. They're not going to be approaching things with the same mindset. They are Israelites in the ancient world. They are not us. When we look at the Israelite kings, We can't think Charlemagne or Louis XVI or Henry VIII. It's not that kind of kingship. They thought about kingship differently. When we read about cities in the biblical text, we can't think in terms of London, Paris, or Chicago. Jerusalem and Babylon are far different places. When we think about marriage in the biblical text, don't think love and romance, not that there wasn't anything like that, but marriage was not built that way. When we think about slavery in the ancient text, we shouldn't think about ethnic exploitation or the bigotry that comes with that, because that's not what slavery was then. We have to think about the world the way they thought about the world. Okay, and so we have to try to accommodate to that world, else we're likely to impose our way of thinking on the text without knowing it, distort the text. So we have to try to enter that world. Now, so we have to see the world the way they did. Here we've got our nice blue earth picture from space. If I had an ancient Israelite right here transported, beam me down, had an ancient Israelite right here to look at that, they wouldn't know what they were looking at. They would have no clue what this was a picture of, because they don't think about the world this way. We can look at this and we can interpret a lot of the things on it. It communicates to us. We know what it's reflecting. But an Israelite would have no idea what that was. They don't think about the world the way we do. And notice also that God did not tell them about this in order to communicate with them. He communicated in terms of their world and how they thought. Because he wasn't trying to reveal to them the ultimate cosmic geography that all people of all time should now believe. It's a good thing because, of course, cosmic geography changes. Even in recent times, cosmic geography changes. I mean, it wasn't 100 years ago that people believed in a steady-state universe. And now Big Bang cosmology is all the thing. That's cosmic geography, and it changed. We used to think Pluto was a planet. Oops. Things change. I was at a conference about a year ago, and there was a UCLA astronomer giving a paper, and he said, "You know why Pluto's not a planet anymore?" No, tell us, please. He said, "Well, we found it with all the improved technology. We found 300 plus other bodies right in the vicinity of Pluto that were exactly the same as Pluto. So we either had to add 300 or take away Pluto. And we couldn't do it to the school kids. They have to learn the names of these things. So it was an act of charity. Anyway, cosmic geography changes. So God didn't reveal cosmic geography for all time. Okay, now, so how did people think in the ancient world? See, that's the question we have to ask. How did they think about the world back then? Well, let's start with Egypt. The Egyptians, this is from an ancient tomb painting, and on your right is, my son's an artist, and so I get him to help me sometimes and draw pictures that kind of help me communicate things. So that's kind of a more modern rendition, but basically the same picture. I don't know about you, but that I get that more than this. But let's talk from this one here. This is a picture of how they viewed the world. This is the solid sky, the dome of the sky, stars emblazoned on her body. Her name's Nut, okay, and she holds back the waters above. That's all of these. That's the waters above. The solar bark is sailing across the skies. There's the sun god. And the sky is held up by the air god, Shu, and here we've got the earth god, Geb, prone across the bottom. The Nut and Geb used to be married. It didn't work out so well, but every once in a while they get hankerings to get back together, and so Shu's got a tough job kind of keeping them apart. But at any rate, you can see that their view of cosmic geography is filled with the gods. That's because we put into a cosmic geography those things which are most important to us. There's prioritization going on. What parts of it do you picture, and how do you picture them? And so we learn a lot by looking at someone else's cosmic geography. And so they've got the gods all through it. That's not a picture of the material cosmos, although it reflects kind of how they thought about the material cosmos, solid dome of the sky, stars emblazoned on the body. I mean, it reflects some of that, but it's really not intended to be a material picture. Okay, they didn't believe that if they walked too far, they would step on her toes or something. It wasn't that kind of way of thinking. But it's filled with the gods. Now, of course, the Israelites wouldn't have this kind of picture. Okay, how would the Israelites think about theirs? Unfortunately, they left us no tomb paintings, so we're kind of stuck producing our own. Again, I got my son to help me on this one. And we just really went through the biblical text and took all the things that were there and tried to reflect them in the picture. Now, here we've got the heavenly temple with its foundations on the waters above. We get that out of Psalms. It's sort of connected to the earthly temple. We've got the solid dome of the skies holding back the waters above, and we've got the waters below. We have a single continent. We have the sun, moon, and stars inside the solid sky. We've got the pillars of the earth reflected here, Sheol, the netherworld, dangling down below, and Leviathan swirling around in the depths. All of it coming out of biblical text. Now, that's a lot different from the Egyptian one, but what you should notice is that it's more different from ours than it is from theirs. To say that another way, if an Egyptian looked at this, they'd know exactly what it was a picture of. And if the Israelites looked at the Egyptian one, they'd know exactly what it was a picture of. But either the Egyptian or the Israelite looking at ours, they would have no clue. This talks about the commonality that is shared among those who lived in the ancient world, even though they have very distinct differences. And we typically discover that when we're comparing between Israel and the other nations around them. Now, if the Israelites thought about the world around them something like that, we have the important question to ask. When God communicates to Israelites, whose cosmic geography does he use? Do we expect God to use our cosmic geography? If so, would he count Pluto as a planet or not? Did he use medieval cosmic geography, Hellenistic cosmic geography? How about the cosmic geography of 100 years from now when we get smarter? No, because cosmic geography always changes. There is no right cosmic geography. And so God just uses theirs. He communicates in terms that are familiar. Not to put a stamp of authority on this cosmic geography, but because you've got to use something to talk about. God wasn't trying to give authoritative revelation about cosmic geography, but he had to use cosmic geography to talk about the things that he is saying with authority. So, as we learn about the way Israel thought about the world, we have to read texts in light of how Israel thought about their world. Now, not only do we have to think about the world the way they thought about the world, we have to think about the text the way that they thought about the text. Remember, if the authority is vested in this ancient author, then whatever he meant by the words is what they mean. The text can't mean what it never meant. And therefore, we are not free to give new meanings to words to accommodate our kind of thinking. We can't say, well, the Bible says that God stretched out the heavens. Big Bang cosmology. They didn't know. No, that doesn't mean Big Bang cosmology. You can't give meaning to the word stretch out the heavens that it didn't have for the author. Now, let me give a little caveat to that. If you found a New Testament author that said, yeah, when they were talking about stretching out the heavens, it was Big Bang cosmology, go with it. But, that doesn't happen. We can't give scientific meaning to words that never had such scientific meaning. Otherwise, we empty it of authority. because now suddenly it's what we want to mean by it, instead of what the author who had authority vested in him meant by it. So authority doesn't really give us a lot of leeway here. We have to read the text the way they read it. Now, as we proceed trying to think the way that they thought, we find out that we've got a little thing to get over here. We have these categories, natural and supernatural, and we're comfortable with them. We talk about miracles, we talk about intervention, all of these concepts that have to do with understanding this divide between natural and supernatural. But that's our categories. What are their categories? Well, I think you'll find, I found, and I think the evidence is clear enough, that in the ancient world, they really didn't have those as two different categories. There's no natural laws, natural science. There's nothing natural. God is involved in all of it. They weren't differentiating different levels of cause. I mean, you can't go back to Aristotle. I mean, we're not dealing in that world yet. And so they considered God to be involved in everything. Nothing's natural. Well, in that way of thinking, it creates some interesting situations, because that means if God's involved in everything, then there's really no such thing in their minds as intervention. Because God's always acting. God's always doing. To intervene, you have to be outside not doing it. And then you can intervene by stepping into something that is not you. Nothing like that in the Bible or in the ancient world. So it's by saying there's no intervention, that doesn't mean God is not acting, that he's kind of always outside, like deism or something. No, he's always at work. Even our word miracle assumes the idea that there are things that God isn't doing, that aren't God's activity, that are non-miracles, and then he does something, and that's a miracle. Those aren't Israelite categories. The Bible talks about signs and wonders. God is showing his power. He is showing his care for his people. He's delivering. He's working and acting all the time. But they wouldn't really call them miracles, like supernatural versus natural. They're signs and wonders. It's not easy for us to think like they thought in the ancient world. Categories are different. Conversations are different. But if we're going to read the text for what it's got for us, we have to kind of wipe that aside. Now, as a result, sometimes when we're thinking about this issue, we think in terms of a pie. And we look at something like origins or really anything else, and we say, okay, these are the things that science can explain by natural laws and natural principles and natural. And so those are the things that science can describe. And then the things that science can't explain, then we say, oh, well, that's God. Okay, and so that's God's work. My daughter's a pastry chef, so, my son's the artist, my daughter's a pastry. We get everybody involved. These are family projects. Okay, so you've got natural and supernatural and kind of slicing up the pie. Now, lots of you know the problem with that kind of thinking. It's sometimes called God of the gaps. Because what ends up happening is that the more you learn from the science side, the smaller and smaller God gets, until soon there's only crumbs left. And so we said, so that's not working. That model doesn't help us understand. So we ate the pie, and we tried something else. I mean, there's something else that's got to work here. That's just the wrong dessert. Okay, so, get my pastry chef daughter going again, and let's try something else. Let's try, a layer cake. Okay, now we're working. I was going to say now we're cooking, but now we're baking. Never mind. Okay, so here if we think in terms of, well, there's the things that we call natural. Okay, that science can explain, and that's basically what I mean by that. Science can explain those things, okay? But our belief is that no matter what science explains, down in that bottom level, that God is doing it all up there on the top level. Now, this isn't trying to do the Kantian divide or anything like that. Don't get too philosophical on me. It's just cake, Okay? But the idea that that in this model, science learns more, it doesn't affect here. Science is just learning more about what's going on down at this level. Science really can't address much up at this level. And no matter what they find, it's still describing what God is doing. Just a different model. Okay, so when we think about this science and Bible kind of thing, now remember that it's not a case that we have to keep making God smaller all the time. Now, a couple principles I want to give you that will help. First of all, observation of natural cause and effect, and this goes back to the cake model, does not remove God from the picture. Just because you can explain something naturalistically or scientifically doesn't take God out of the picture. Psalm 139:13, you knit me together in my mother's womb. You know, that doesn't rule out all of embryology. Okay, that doesn't make OB-GYN specialists apostate atheists. We don't picket their offices or anything. It's everything that they learn about the growth of the fetus in the womb is simply telling us more about the ways in which God knits us together in our mother's womb. These are not mutually exclusive claims. See, we're examining claims here. The claim the Bible makes is not really in conflict with the claims that scientists make. Both can be true. In that sense, there's no conflict. So we have to understand that just in principle, this can work out just fine. Okay, secondly, I would claim that there is no scientific revelation in the Bible. Now, by scientific revelation, what I mean is, does God give the Israelites any information that changes their minds about how the world commonly, regularly works? I'm not talking about things we call miracles here. Okay, but does God give them information that kind of lifts them to the next level of how the world around them regularly, normally works? And I can't find anything that offers that kind of understanding. God does not upgrade them scientifically. Example with the heart. In the ancient world, they had no understanding of the physiology of the brain. They knew it was there, of course, when the Egyptians mummified. They took out everything that was important to preserve the real person. And for the Egyptians, that was the entrails. That's the kidney, the liver, okay, the intestines. Those things came out, were treated very carefully because that's where the real person was. Brain? No, hook up the nose, pull it out, throw it away. It's gone, meaningless. So they had no understanding of the physiology of the brain, and they really had no understanding of the physiology of the kidney or the liver. They thought that the physiology of what we know as the physiology of the brain was connected to the kidney and the liver and the heart, even the stomach. I still sometimes think with my stomach, but that's not physiology. So we have an uninformed physiology. And when God talks to the Israelites, He doesn't upgrade them. He doesn't tell them really, truly, they think with their brains. There isn't even an ancient Hebrew word for brain that we know. They probably had one, but we don't know it. When your Bible talks about the mind, all your heart, soul, mind, that's the word for entrails. Translators helping you. So they don't upgrade. God talks about the heart as the center of emotion and thought and intellect and will. It's the heart. God doesn't upgrade them and say, well, no, it's just a blood pump. He adopts the physiology that is familiar to them. And as a result, then, God is not trying to endorse with His authority a certain physiology. Good thing, we'd have some problems. But He does use it as a framework for communication. And in that way, the Israelites think like everybody else in the ancient world about physiology, and God doesn't change it. Now, that brings us to an interesting dilemma. That is, we have to carefully consider what scientific claims the Bible may be making. After all, if there's no scientific revelation, if this is not a science textbook and is trying to teach science, if there's no upgraded science in it, is it making any scientific claims with authority? We have to ask the question. So, let's move into the question of origins and see what we find. Now, I am not using science as sort of what pushes my exegesis. I'm not even using ancient Near East as pushing my exegesis, trying to make it conform to what I find in science or the ancient world. I am using the text. And then with an interpretation of the text, then I can say, how does that fit the ancient Near East? Or how does it give a different view of the ancient Near East? And I'll look at the text and say, how does that fit compatibility with science? Or how does it differ? But the text is what drives us. Science or ancient Near East could at times prompt us to look at something again. But the text is in the driver's seat as far as my methods are concerned. Again, in the end, I'm a text analyst, so we're going to talk about text. So if you opened up to Genesis 1 and started reading about day 1, you'd get to verse 5 and you'd say, so God called the light day and the darkness he called night. And these texts are so familiar to us that we often don't even pause to think about questions that we might ask. For instance, when you read verse 5, do you ever ask yourself, why didn't God call the light light? What's going on? Why does he call the light day? Day is not the same as light, and light is not the same as day, and you don't have to be a physicist to figure that out. And of course, likewise, when the Israelites are talking about light, they're not arguing about particle and wave theory. Okay, so they're not using light the way a physicist would use light, and we need to read it in their context. But furthermore, what are they doing naming it day? We also discover that in the ancient world, that naming was an important act of creation. Because by naming something, you were giving it a role and a purpose and an ordered system. And that was a creative act. And so if we ask, what is the creative act here in day 1? What God created on day 1 is day and night. Well then, how does light fit into it all? And why, again, are they naming light day? Well, it's really not too hard to work out when you ask it the other way. What is day, and how does that relate to light? Well, day is a period of light. Well, that's basic metonymy. It's a rhetorical device, and it works just fine. God called the period of light day, and God called the period of darkness night. Well, that was easy. Be an exegete, easy stuff. No. Okay, so move back to verse 4. God separated the light from the darkness. Ooh, if you're a physicist, that's a problem. Can't separate them because they can't be together because one is the absence of the other, and so what in the world is this text talking about? But of course, we've already resolved the problem in verse 5, and we can resolve it in verse 4 the same way. God separated a period of light from a period of darkness. And the period of light he called day, period of darkness he called night. Day 1, evening and morning. Transitions between the period of light and the period of darkness. Cool. Okay, that's working. Everybody with me? See how we're going here? Yeah, I've got you then. Okay, back up one more verse. Come with me. Verse 3. God said, let there be, hold it. Wait for it. What did we do in 5? What did we do in 4? Let's be consistent. God said, let there be a period of light. And God distinguished that period of light from period of darkness. And the period of light he called day, and the period of darkness he called night. And there was evening and morning, day 1. So, what did God create on day 1? On day 1, God created the basis of time. Alternating periods of day and night. Alternating periods of light and darkness. And that's the basis for time. And we find then that on day one, God did not create any material objects. This is something that has to do with order, with how the cosmos works, how it functions. And God created that on day one. Now, at that point, you should say, well, okay, notice that we've now starting to see some differences. You might say, well, when I think about origins, when I think about creation, I tend to think about God making material objects in a material cosmos. Good for you. That's our world. No surprises there. But is that what an Israelite would think? Is that what a Babylonian or a Canaanite would think? What is the ancient world view about all of this? After all, it's not important what origins questions we want to ask or what origins account we would give. We're trying to read them, read their text. And so we finally asked the question that, boy, it would have been nice if we had asked it all along. What kind of origins account is this? Yes! That's the question. And instead of thinking that we're going to start reading Genesis knowing what kind of origins account it is, now we've been put enough off balance that we can ask, okay, you tell me, biblical author, what kind of origins account is this? Let me wipe my slate clean as much as I can of my modern assumptions and start reading the text. Let's look. If we're going to find out what kind of origins account it is, we better start looking at some of the language that's used. So, the verb that we translate create, bara, Hebrew verb, let's take a look at it. Now, how do we find out what a Hebrew word means? You know, the Israelite authors left us many, many books, but a dictionary was not one of them. So unfortunately, we're stuck with having to figure out what these words mean all by ourselves. Now, how do we figure out what words mean in an ancient context? The way you always figure out what words mean. Usage, usage, usage. Remember, words can change meaning. We experience it regularly. You know, there used to be a mathematical term of 1 with 100 zeros behind it, and the technical term for that was a Google. Now it's a verb. When we Google something. Words change meanings by usage. Okay, so when we want to understand a word, we have to look at its usage. And we don't want to just know how to translate it. This goes beyond the question of translation. By the time I'm done, I'm not going to argue with that translation at all. Okay, but there's nuances. When they say create, are they talking about all the same things that we mean when we say create? We could say that to create means to bring something from non-existence to existence. And that's pretty good. Creation is to transition from non-existence to existence. So, what do you mean by existence? What does it mean if something doesn't exist? See, immediately all the answers that come to your mind are material in nature. Something exists when you can see it, touch it, appeal to the senses. That's a cultural decision. But we don't often recognize that there could be another alternative. It's not always easy to try to step into their world and think the way that they think. So, we look at usage, 50 occurrences. We first learn that it only takes God as subject or actor, so it's a divine activity. That's important, but it's not the most important. Because what's most important is, what is the direct object? Think about even English. in English, we could use the verb create, and we could say that we created a committee. Now, I wish that was an act of creation out of nothing, because then I wouldn't be asked to serve on such a committee. They could just make people to serve on committee. You know, like in LA when they put a mannequin in the passenger seat so they can ride in the carpool lane. Anyway, but it's not that way. We talk about creating a curriculum, creating a masterpiece, creating a recipe, creating havoc. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not on the undergrad side of the campus. Okay, yeah, all kinds of things that we use, and we always have a very good sense of what that verb create means in that context because of the direct object. That gives us our clue. Okay, let's take that knowledge and apply it to Hebrew text. So it takes a wide variety of direct objects. Well, let's take a look and see what some of them are. This is just a select group. It's certainly not comprehensive. In my book, I've got a chart of all of them, and you can look at them yourself. But what I want to point out here is something that's obvious to anybody who looks at the list, that lots of these direct objects are not material objects. They're grammatically direct objects, but they are not material objects. And even if they are material, the city of Jerusalem, after all, is material, you know, the wall's there, but that's not what that text is saying. It's the idea of Jerusalem that's being created. And so we can see that the verb bara in Hebrew certainly does not imply a material object being manufactured. That means we have to be careful with our contexts and see what kinds of things are being laid out. Here you can see that many of these have to do with organization, order, function, things of that sort. I mean, here God's creating darkness. Certainly not an object. So we start getting a sense of this verb bara, and that it's not necessarily tied into material objects. Okay, so if day one doesn't have a material object created, and if the verb doesn't necessarily imply that kind of thing, what are some other ways we can check this out? Well, if it's create and we're moving from one condition to another, non-existence to existence, we need to take a look at the before picture. What did it look like before God created? Now, you can't go to verse 1 for that. Verse 1 is, in my interpretation and many people's, there's good support for this, I think. It's a literary introduction. It's not actually telling you about God creating something. It's telling you that it's going to tell you about God creating something. So, in the beginning, God created heavens and earth. Let me tell you how he did it. Because God's creating heavens and earth took place in the 7 days, not before the 7 days. And we know that because we get to the end and it said, so God created the heavens and the earth in the 7 days. Okay, so this is just literary introduction. So the before picture is verse 2. Now that becomes very important here. So when we look at verse 2, and it describes it as tohu vavohu, formless and empty, something of that sort. But let's take a careful look. Let's take a look at what condition is described in verse 2. Is it a condition without materials? Let's read. Now the earth, wait. Earth. Where'd that come from? Go on. The earth was formless. Plato? What are we talking about here? What does that word mean? Thank you for asking. We'll get to that in a moment. And darkness was over the surface of the deep. The deep. How come the actors are on the stage already? What kind of account is this? And what we find as we read verse 2 is that the starting point is not lacking matter. Earth, sea, they're there already. The starting point is lacking order. Now, Does that bear up? Well, first of all, from the ancient world, we find out that darkness and sea are elements of non-order in the ancient world. Israel is thinking along the lines of everybody else in the ancient world, starting with non-order. Then we take a look at the terminology, tohu vavohu, and we find out that tohu refers not so much to something that is shapeless, formless, but rather something that is lacking worth or purpose, lacking order, lacking function in an ordered system. Again, I've got the chart of all the uses in the book, and you can check it out yourself. So here we find that the text is not dealing with a situation where matter is lacking, but where order is lacking. We find a parallel in Egyptian. There it talks about the non-existent. The non-existence is a place that's not integrated into the ordered world, not differentiated, not assigned a function, has potential, but there it is. It's not functioning yet. They'll call the cosmic sea non-existent. They'll call the desert non-existent. They send their enemies into the non-existent, and that doesn't mean that they're annihilated in body and spirit. They just driven off into the non-existent realm. Now, the philosophical term for thinking about existence is ontology. And so ontology, what does it mean for something to exist? Clearly, the ontology of the ancient world is different from ours. We have what we could call a material ontology. Things exist when they take material form and shape. Okay, but in the ancient world, that's not where the line is. So for us today, the line between non-existence and existence is a material line. Okay, it becomes material. In the ancient world, the line between non-existence and existence is not material, it is functional. It has to do with order. Same concepts, it's creating. But the line is in a different place. It's not how we think. But we can't be driven in the text by how we think. We have to try to understand how they think. Now, that leads me then to propose the functional focus for this origins account. When we ask what kind of origins account is this, the leaning that we're getting from the day one, what we looked at, from the verb bara, from verse 2 and how it starts, the beginning point, is all pushing us toward function and order and purpose and role. So that's what I'm going to propose as trying to describe what kind of origins account this is. If the ancient functional focus is the key, then existence is defined by having a function. And by that I don't mean, so when we talk about the sun functioning, I'm not talking about, was it a burning ball of gas? No, that's scientific functioning. We're not talking about that. I want to know, was it functioning for people in the world that God made for them? And it can't do that until they are there. Tree falls in a forest and nobody's there to hear it. Will it make a sound? Interesting question. Okay, so I'm not talking about scientific functions. I'm talking about functions for people. The ordered world that they're talking about has people as the key part of it. Okay, so if people aren't there, nothing's functioning. Take the account of a house that's been built and nobody's living in it. It may well be that the electricity's hooked up, the water's hooked up. If anybody were there to turn the faucets and throw the switches, it would work perfectly well. But it's not functioning because nobody's there. That's what we're talking about with functioning. Not being able and ready to function, but actually functioning for someone. In that context, good is not referring to something that's perfect. Hebrew tov does not refer to that. Now, you could make the case that, but when it says God is good, isn't that perfection? Well, God is perfect, yes, I'm not arguing with that, but that's not what is conveyed by the Hebrew word there. The Hebrew word being used throughout the usage in the Old Testament is talking about something that's working the way that it should work. That's many of the contexts that you get. Functioning properly in an ordered system. When I got on a plane to fly down here, I assume that the pilot's in the cockpit doing the pre-flight check, the checklist. You know, he's going down the list. You know, flaps, good. Engine, good. Food. Anyway. Oh, that's not on the list anymore. Okay. So, you know, making sure it's ready to function. Now, how do I know that it means that here? Context, context, context. We would really know what it meant by good if there were only something that was not good. If it only described a not good situation, then we'd know what good was. If it was not good for... we do have something. It's not good for man to be alone. That's not a statement about moral perfection. We won't explore that. It's not, you know, it's just saying that's not fully functional yet. Genesis 1, then, I would suggest, provides an account of functional origins, not an account of material origins. The origins of order, not the origins of stuff, objects. Genesis 1 is about God bringing order, functionality into the midst of non-order, non-functionality. And that's how things work in the ancient world as well. But you can see I'm not imposing it from the ancient world. I'm showing it to you in the text and then saying, oh, by the way, the ancient world thinks this way as well. Now, as a result, in this approach, it doesn't make any sense to ask what objects God created on any given day. Just the wrong questions for the wrong text. The text is not talking about objects being manufactured. The text is not concerned with the existence of matter. Those questions are immaterial. Yeah. My students somehow learn to live with it, you know. Naming and separating are principal acts of creation. We don't think of them that way. But this is throughout the ancient world. These are the terms they think in. To give something a name is to give it a role and a purpose in an ordered system. To separate it out from other things distinguishes it for having its own role, its own place in an ordered system. These are creative acts. Let me use the example of, I've talked about building a house already, so let me use this example. We like having students over the house, and lots of times they'll ask about our place, make observations about it. And when they ask me about our place, they don't want me to describe the plumbing and the electrical wiring, the material of the roof and how old or new it is, and the foundation, the heating, air conditioning. No. They're not asking that question. Now, when we think about the cosmos, if we talked about the cosmos as a house, that would be the material cosmos. And of course, that's the way our world likes to think. We like to think about the origins of the house, the material aspects of the cosmos. And I'm glad we do. I'm glad science does those things because that helps us understand our world better. That's a good thing. Okay, but that's a certain kind of question. And of course, what we've learned as we've learned more about the universe, the expanding universe in which we live, is that in this house story that science helps us understand, we are largely insignificant. I mean, even our galaxy is insignificant in the stretches of the universe, not to mention our solar system or our planet or our continent or our city or me. And the house story makes us feel a little bit puny. A termite's egg in the... Anyway, okay? I won't press the analogy. Okay? So, but the house story is important to us. That's one story of origins. But see, when my students ask about our place, they don't want to hear the house story. when my students ask about our place, they want to hear the home story. They don't want the origins of the house. They want the origins of the home. They want to know how it became our place, how it works for us, how long we've been there, and they want the home story. It's an origin story, but it's a different origin story. See, when we come to a biblical text, we have to ask, which origin story are they telling? There's any number of different origin stories you could tell, and we know which one we have interest in because of our scientific mentality, because of the issues of the day and the arguments we have. Conversations. So we know what our world is, but we want to know what their world is. What origin story will they be inclined to tell? What origin story are they telling? What origin story has most significance to them in their world? We have to ask those questions. Let me give you an example. So, say there was a big play that was showing in Cincinnati, and a couple hours away, but somebody had extra tickets, and they gave you the tickets. And, boy, you'd never be able to afford those tickets. You'd have never bought those. You got a tight budget, but here somebody gave you these tickets. So you're real excited about it, and you make your way up to Cincinnati, and lo and behold, even though today was 70 degrees, it's suddenly 16 degrees, and there's snow, and I know that never happens here, but so, the traffic's difficult, and it takes longer than you thought, and you get into Cincinnati, and you've got the address, but there's construction on some of the streets, and there's one-way streets, and you get all turned around, and then you finally get to the theater, and you say, oh, I've got to park somewhere, and there's no parking anywhere, so you go looking for a park, right? And just everything's going wrong, and you're real stressed about it all because you're really excited about this play. And so you finally get a parking spot, and you head on into the theater, and there you stand at the back, and you look at your tickets, and you say, yeah, right down in the third row. Great tickets, bad timing. So, you go very quietly. The play's, well underway, and you sneak down, and then oh no, I'm right in the middle of the row there. Excuse me. And finally you sit down. But then, of course, there's the play going on. So you're already embarrassed enough. So you say, how'd the play start? Well, the gentleman next to you says, this theater was built in 1921. The play was written 5 years later, and it was a Pulitzer Prize candidate for that year. The playwright had a long history of critical acclaim, and so when this theater decided to do it, they built a particular set for it. Do you know they got the Jones & Jones Company to build this set? Isn't it beautiful? And the script writer who did and you say, no. How did the play begin? Oh, why didn't you say so? See, there are different origin stories you can tell. We've opened Genesis 1, and we thought we knew what kind of origin story it is. Maybe we should be open-minded and see if maybe it's something that we didn't consider, because the ancient world is not familiar to us. Funny thing about a home story, instead of being insignificant, in the home story, we're honored guests. Now, is the Bible telling the house story or the home story? It's a legitimate question to ask. In a home story, we're honored guests because God has done this for us, ordered it for us, made it function for us. Scientists might call that the fine-tuned universe, the anthropic principle. We just call it good theology. God made the world for us. But that's not all. He made it to be our home. But it's not quite our home. In fact, it's actually a B&B, a bread and breakfast, because it's God's place. It's His home, and He's made it accommodating to us because He wants to be here in relationship with us. So the home story is that it's made to function for us, just like a bed and breakfast is set up to function for the guests. But it belongs to somebody else. And they want to relate to us. You know, when Jesus is talking to the disciples in the upper room, John 14, He tells them, you know, I'm going away. No, don't do it. You know, I'm going away. But don't worry about it. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I'm going to prepare a place for you, then I'll come back to get you, to take you there, so that, don't miss it, so that where I am, you might also be. That's not the first time that God was preparing a place for us. That's what this is. That's where we are. God has prepared this place for us so that where we are, He is. Relationship. That's what it's about. Now, if God's presence is somewhere, that makes it sacred space. So I would like to propose that what we've got is God preparing sacred space. The home story for God is the origins of sacred space. Not an empty cosmos, not just a house with nobody living in it, but now a place for us, functioning for us, Him living there with us. Now, so I've suggested already that day one is telling you about time. God created time, a function, part of the ordered world. Day two, God makes is He making a solid dome? For those of you who know Hebrew, the rakia. Is He making a solid dome, or is He making, like NIV translates, the expanse? Well, in the book, Lost World of Genesis 1, I favored the solid sky. I've changed my mind. It happens, you know. And largely that's not because I changed my mind about whether there was a solid sky. I changed my mind about whether rakia is the word for solid sky. And I changed my mind because I found another Hebrew word that I think is the word for solid sky, and therefore this is not the word for solid sky, and therefore the rakia is the expanse. It's the air bubble. You remember the Egyptian picture? The god Shu that's in there creating the living space for people as he holds apart the sky and the earth. Although in the Israelite account, it's the waters above and the waters below that are being held apart by this expanse. Now, you need to notice then that this word rakia is not an object. They're not thinking molecules of hydrogen and helium and oxygen. Okay, we're not talking about materiality here. God's creating living space. And it's in that living space that we find that and again, the dome's holding up the waters above, the waters below. Everybody in the ancient world believed there were waters above. This is nothing new or revolutionary in any way. Everybody believed that. Okay, and it's those waters above that contribute to what God is setting up a system of in this day, and that is weather. Then the third day, He doesn't manufacture any objects. He just says, let the dry land emerge. It's already there. Let the dry land emerge, and let these plants sprout. Let them drop seed and sprout. That's an order, function kind of system. And He sets that up to work in an ordered realm. And so on the third day, that's why we can have food. The first 3 days then, God created significant functions for human existence: time, weather, food. Now I submit that if you go to any culture in any time period, pick your place, pick your time, pick your people group, okay, they all understand very well the issues of time, weather, and food. Not so much quarks and supernova, but time, weather, and food they've got down pat. Matter of fact, most every conversation you have with a stranger is about time, weather, or food. I mean, they're really kind of the only things we ever talk about when it gets down to it. It'd be hard to add a number 4 to the list. This is our ordered world, and God set it up. Now, is the text aware that these are the 3 categories that constitute the ordered cosmos in which humans live? Yeah. Look at Genesis 8:22 after the flood. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, that sounds like food. Cold, heat, summer, winter, sounds like weather, day and night, time will never cease. The text knows these categories. I could take you through cuneiform texts that these are the categories they work with. Sumerian texts, Babylonian texts, Egyptian texts, from early literature all the way into the Hellenistic period, these are the categories. And they talk about creation in these terms. I don't have time to do that tonight. Okay, so we have the 3 functions. Days 4, 5, and 6 are different, though. Days 4, 5, and 6 are functionaries that inhabit those areas. So we get the sun, moon, and stars. We get the birds and the fish. We get the land creatures and people. They inhabit those. Now, so functionaries are part of the picture, that God fills the earth with these functionaries. Now, we could say, well, okay, now we're getting to God making objects. Okay, but, if you've got to wait to day 6 to get there, you still would question, what kind of creation account is this? I mean, you say, but what about day 4? God made the sun, moon, and stars. Question. When we think about the moon, we say, oh, well, that's a rock in orbit, 375,000 miles away on average, pocked by the asteroids, reflecting the light of the sun, rotating, revolving. Those are all it doesn't go through our mind, it's so subconscious, but this is how we think about the moon. It's a material picture of the moon. Do the Israelites know any one of those details? No, they don't. Okay, so when they talk about the moon, what are they thinking? What's their material picture? No, not green cheese. Try again. What's their material picture? No. They don't have one. They don't know the moon is an object. Same with sun and stars. They don't know they're objects. Well, what do they think they are? Exactly what they call them. Lights. So when the text talks about God making sun, moon, and stars, the Israelites are not thinking God's making objects. Even though we know they're objects, and we can say God made those objects. By the way, yes, He did, of course. God built the house. Yes, of course, He did. But we're not asking all the things that God did. That would be a long lecture. But we're asking, what is this story? What's the Genesis 1 account? What origin story are they telling? It's not about objects. Now, but we say, but it says made. It said God made. Hebrew word asa. What about that? Hebrew, when students learn Hebrew, they learn asa means to do or to make. Let me tell you, that is only the beginning. Asa occurs over 2,600 times, and it's translated dozens of different ways in any given translation. So we're really kind of doing a shortcut here to say it means to do or to make, not to mention the fact that do and make are very different things. So what does the text talk about when it says that God asad the sun, moon, and stars? What kind of activity is that? Well, we do a little looking around. Exodus 20 is often brought up in the 4th commandment. In 6 days you shall do, that's asa, all of your work. On the 7th day you shall not do, that's asa. any of your work, for in 6 days the Lord your God, asa, the heavens and the earth. Okay, well, now what's going on? We translated do here and we translated do there. Why don't we translate do here? Well, of course, I'll tell you why. Because in English, it doesn't make any sense to say God did the heavens and the earth. We're driven by Hebrew idiom, not by Hebrew words. So what kind of activity is it talking about here in Exodus 20 as it clearly refers back to the 7-day account in Genesis? Well, look at Genesis 2:2. By the 7th day, God had finished all the work, same word, all the work that he had been doing, that's asa. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Same word. Now, here we can see Exodus 20 is quoting Genesis 2 and, importantly, Genesis 2:3. Then the Lord God blessed the 7th day and made it holy because on it he rested from the work. What is God's work? The work of creating, that's bara. That he had done, that's asa. What does it mean for God to asa something in Genesis 1? He's doing his work. What is that work? He's baraing. He's creating. Is that a material manufacturing process? No reason to think so. We can look at other uses. Genesis 3:21, God asas the garments for Adam and Eve. Wow, that's an interesting use. Amos 5:8, God asas the constellations. Obviously not a material kind of process here. Isaiah 44:22, the servant is formed in the womb. Often involves supervising, commissioning, delegating. Job 37:2-13, lists of what God does, asa, is filled with functions. We need to press on. Getting the idea, trying to understand the story they are telling. So, boy, cosmogony outside of Genesis. Formed summer and winter, created north and south. Mountains born, world brought forth, planted the cedars. These are all creative activities. Created waters above the skies. Conclusions outside Genesis. Different concepts, certainly, but uses verbs, make, form, create, interchangeably. Mixes ongoing with initial, all these kinds of things. When we look at the text carefully, I'm sorry I don't have time to go through these. Time is marching on. Okay, material cosmos certainly is attributed to God, but that doesn't mean that's the story Genesis 1 is telling. More interested in function, order, and God's controlled rule. Okay, we need another important element here. Let's talk about this sacred space idea. I refer to it as the cosmic temple. Now, when we read Genesis 1, the 7-day account, we get to day 7 and we're a little bit confused. Because now we say, well, why would God need to rest? I mean, he doesn't get tired, he doesn't need sleep, he doesn't need downtime, leisure, he's not reading a good novel. What's up with God needing rest? And furthermore, what is this concept doing in a creation account? This is a creation account. Why would it talk about that? Well, see, we need some pieces of information that we do not have. If you were to show this 7-day account to a Babylonian or an Egyptian, they would look at it and they would say, oh, this is a temple account. And you would say, oh, what do you mean? How? I don't see the word temple there. I'm even reading Hebrew text, and I don't see the word temple there. What do you mean it's a temple account? They said, well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? Well, they say, well, God rests. Yeah. Bill and I had a professor that, would kind of coax you to get the right word, and, come on, give me the right word, some obscure thing that was in his brain that we didn't have any chance of getting. But every once in a while, just a lucky guess, he's going like this, and then you'd say the word, he'd say, exactly. So here the Babylonians and Egyptians would be doing the same thing to us. Come on, think. Well, there's something we don't know. What we don't know is that in the ancient world, gods rest in temples. And therefore, if God is resting, it's a temple story. Temples were built for gods to rest in. And therefore, something that is obvious to any reader in the ancient world, we miss entirely. The temple is not only a house for the deity, it is the command center of the cosmos. This is where the God runs the cosmos. You know, it's just like if you were thinking of the White House and you thought it was all about the Lincoln bedroom. No, it's about the Oval Office, folks. You know, it's where the president runs the country. That's what makes that important. And it's the same thing with the temple. This is where God runs the company. It's the country, the cosmos. It's the hub of operations. Okay? And we see that this is addressed in a biblical theology of rest. When God says that He's going to bring the Israelites rest from their enemies all around, it's not that He's going to bring them, what, leisure time? No. Stability, security, order, so they can live their lives. When Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you naps." No. I will give you rest. And that's the order and stability of kingdom living. And there's a yoke to carry. Take my yoke upon you. But it's rest because there's order and stability in the kingdom. And Hebrews 4 tells us you've not yet entered that rest. See, the biblical theology of rest helps us understand this. That it has to do with kingdom, not leisure. God ceases His ordering, Shabbat, to cease. He ceases His ordering because it is now optimally ordered for human life, and therefore He takes His command. God's rest is equivalent to God's rule. Let's look at the text. Psalm 132, let us go to His dwelling place, temple. Let us worship at His footstool. Come to your resting place, menucha. Okay, and you in the ark of your might, for the Lord has chosen Zion. This is my dwelling. It's a temple. This is my resting place forever and ever, and here I will sit enthroned. God's rest is equated with His rule. You know, when you move into a new place, a new apartment, new house, what do you start with? Boxes everywhere. No order whatsoever. You cannot live your life in boxes. And so you begin ordering your world, unpacking the boxes, putting everything in its place. And you order that world, and when you're done ordering it, the last box unpacked, someday I'll get there. I've only lived in my house 8 years, so someday I'll get to that last box. But at any rate, when you finally get to that last box, then you can say, and you take a nap, and then you leave and never come back. No, of course not. We're not, okay? You now are able to rest, which means you are in a controlled environment which you have set up and ordered for your use, and you are now able to function normally in that ordered setting. Creation. People may be the climax of the 6 days, but make no mistake, rest is the climax of the creation account. Do not talk to me about the 6 days of creation. It's a 7-day process. And without the 7th day, it's meaningless. God doesn't order it for nothing. What did God do on the 8th day? He ruled. What did He do the 9th day? He ruled. That's what He did the 6 days for, to enter that rest and to rule. And He's been doing it ever since. Rest is the main goal of creation. See, and we lose that entirely when we think that this is a house story, when we think it's about material objects, because then we don't know what to do with day 7. But rest is the main goal of creation. He is ordering it in order that we rest in it. We do, He does, relationship. Resting expresses control over an ordered system. Rest is not the opposite of activity. Rest is not becoming uninvolved. Engagement not disengagement. Rest is something we engage in. It's not disengaging from everything. Rest God gives resolves unrest. That's what this origin story is about. Now, we get to the 7 days question, and we have arguments. Does it mean a 24-hour day and therefore mean a young earth? Is it talking about kind of longer days? Are they literary days? Are they extended days? And we get talking about what day means, so we can talk about kind of how we understand a biblical view of the cosmos. All of that discussion assumes that we've got a material house account. So, I believe the word day suggests it should be a 24-hour period. I always believed that. I was young earth for more than half my life because I always believed that. I didn't know what else to do with that piece of information. But I was assuming that it was a material account, a house story. The discussion then often concerns the age of the earth because we've already decided that we think it's a house story. But if the 7 days is connected to a temple and sacred space, then we ought to think about a temple inauguration. After all, are we doing good? After all, when Solomon built the temple, he spent 7 years building the structure, the house. And we've got the house story in part in 1 Kings. But then, when that's all done, and you sit there and look at it, complete, is it a temple? I know it's late, but shake your heads this way, okay? No, it's not a temple. And why isn't it a temple? Well, God's not in it. A temple isn't just describing a structure. A temple is describing a function. So how do they transition from a house to a home? From a building to a temple? Well, that takes place in an inauguration period. And in that inauguration period, follow this, they proclaim the functions of the temple. They install the functionaries of the temple. Have a familiar ring to it? God takes up his rest in it, and it becomes the place of his rule, of his home with people where he can relate to them. So, if we're talking about sacred space and the inauguration of sacred space, if 7 days is like a temple inauguration, then objects aren't being made. I mean, golly, they're not going to go into the temple dedication and they're still trying to put together the building. If the days are concerned with bringing order rather than making things, the 7 days has nothing to do with the age of the earth. In that case, the Bible is not making any claims about the age of the earth. If the Bible were making claims, I'd stand right up there and say, yes, I believe that. Again, for more than half my life, that's where I was. But if we're not dealing with the material account, then it's not making those claims, and therefore the 7 days has nothing to do with the age of the earth. Now, that doesn't mean that science, therefore, gets to rule and whatever it says is fine. Maybe you still think, even if the Bible doesn't say anything about the age of the earth, maybe you still think it's young. Fine. But don't say that that's because that's what the Bible says. Okay? If you think the science supports a young earth, go for it. I'm not a scientist. Furthermore, if you think that, I'm really out to lunch and this is a crazy man speaking up here, and that you can't see that there's any sense of possibility that the Bible is talking about what I'm suggesting, and that you really believe the Bible is a house story, stick with it. We have to stand by what we believe the Bible is claiming. I'm only asking you to consider information that I'm putting on the table. I'm not here to persuade anybody. There's going to be no altar call, four verses, no card signed at the back, okay? I'm not trying to persuade. I'm trying to give information that might be useful to some of you. Maybe some of you not at all. But this is an important conversation to have. It's important for 3 reasons that I'd like to suggest. And with this I conclude. 3 reasons. First of all, it's important because the church isn't necessarily doing a very good job with certain aspects of ministry. We've got science people, science professionals, science teachers, science students, all riddled through our churches. How are we doing at serving them? I've got a colleague in biology, and when she goes to a church and they start asking about her, the minute she says, I'm a biology teacher, she knows exactly what the next question is going to be. And she dreads it. Because she said, the minute I say anything about that, I am going to be marginalized. And suddenly, I am not a worthy member of that congregation anymore. We're not doing a very good job ministering to Christians in science. As a matter of fact, we tell our kids not to go into science. It's the devil's playground. And so no wonder science is filled with non-Christians. We're not doing a very good job of ministry. Secondly, we're not doing a very good job of evangelism. There are plenty of people out there in our universities who are intrigued by Christianity because they are intrigued by Christians that they have come to know and that they respect. And then they get the message from wherever that, oh, well, if you become a Christian, you've got to give up all of those scientific conclusions that you believe. And we end up adding to the gospel something that's not there. The age of the earth and human origins and name all your other issues are not, we can't encumber the gospel with those things. They don't determine whether you are in the kingdom or not. And so we end up having obstacles to our evangelistic conversations. And finally, you can guess number 3, we've got a basic problem with attrition. Young people leaving the church by the droves because they grew up being told that there's a war and that you've got a choice to make. And if you choose science, you've rejected the Bible and rejected theology and rejected Jesus, and you're out. And they've bought that. And then they go off to college, to university, and they are given an explanation that sounds pretty persuasive to them. And then it's that uh-oh moment. The science makes sense to them. But they've been told they have to choose and that it's a war. And so they say, well, I guess I'm not a Christian anymore because I believe that the earth is old, or because I believe in the human genome and what it suggests. And so the back doors of the church are just, people are getting trampled, running out. Does it really have to be that way? What claims is the Bible making? Are we sure we've got them straight? Is the war what it's made out to be? It's been made out to be a war from people on the right, from people on the left. We get these big debates, and the media loves pitting the extremes against one another. Is that really what we're doing? Is the war what we think it is? Final story. Some of you might know it. There was a Japanese soldier. He and his squadron were put on an island to defend in the Pacific in World War II. And one by one, they were marginalized or died or got killed or something, and there's just one guy left. And but he was given that job. He did that job. He's working that island. He's protecting it. And the Armistice Day came, and the the war ended, but he was not told. And they tried to tell him. They dropped the leaflets. They tried to send messengers in, and he didn't believe any of it. Didn't believe the leaflets. That's propaganda. Didn't believe the messengers. You've been bought. And he just kept fighting his war. 1973, he finally came out and acknowledged that he had been wrong. See, he wouldn't believe the war was over. As Christians, as thinking Christians, we've got a lot at stake. And we have to consider carefully what the biblical text claims. And if we do that, we may just find out that the war is over.